thank you that you're the God who sees. You see my children who are not walking with you. And just as you were so gracious to me, thank you that you're gracious to them. Lord, you see the bank account. There's not enough, there's too much month at the end of the money, right? We've had those months before. Lord, you see. You're not blind to that. You haven't turned a blind eye or a deaf ear. You're the God who sees. You're the God who hears. You're the God who responds. See, when you think of the one sense of God who sees, then it makes you kind of jump into the next points of all the other senses from a human standpoint of what he does. He's not deaf to us. He hears us. He acts. He responds. There is a lady who was of no nobility, no honor, no really respect, if you wanted to use that word. And she called God a name that was beautiful. It's one I've come back to many times. It can be in a good way. It also can be in a convicting way. But in this way, in this passage, it's really good. Genesis chapter 16. Go to Genesis chapter 16, verses 13 and 14. There's a lady who was a servant, a maidservant, a slave, if you want to call it, and her name was Hagar. Many of you remember that story. Messy story, messy situation. Isn't it interesting how Abraham and Sarah were such people of faith, but they also didn't get everything right, did they? Many times they tried to help God out, didn't they? And when we try to help God with our own plan, man, we create train wrecks, don't we? And then we really need to pray, right? So that's what had happened with Abraham and Sarah. It was Sarah and Abraham's fault. I ultimately give it to Abraham because he was the leader of his household. And he went in and slept with Hagar to have offspring because Abraham and Sarah were too old. So Sarah recommended it, and Abraham said, okay. And it was wrong on both parts. A lot like Adam and Eve, right? I think there's a strong connection there. I won't go into that. So anyway, Hagar had this boy. So guess what Abraham thought he finally had? His promised son. And God said, nope, that's not the one I promised you. You're supposed to obey me and wait on me. And so what was the relationship between Sarah and Hagar after that? It was bad. Yep, it was dysfunctional. It was prejudice. It was everything you can think of, man. And Hagar, she finally had enough, and what'd she do? She ran away. And what was kind of her cry when she ran away with her boy? What are we going to do? We're going to die. It's over. I'm running away, but I can't take this anymore. Because Sarah had become so harsh to her in that time. She was not perfect, while Sarah was a really neat lady, far from perfect. And so as she's sitting there, in Genesis chapter 16, who came to meet her there? Angel of the Lord. And what happened with that angel of the Lord? Did he condemn her? Did he beat her down even more? Nope, he gave her a promise, even for her son, even though he wasn't the promised son or the chosen son like Isaac was going to be. But after this encounter happened, verse 13, she named the Lord. Isn't that funny? Have you ever thought about naming the Lord? I obviously need to be careful if you do that. But this was very beautiful. So she named the Lord who spoke to her. You are who? Anybody know what that name was? El Roi. Yeah, depending on how you say it. For she said, in this place I have actually seen the one who sees me. That is why the well is called Beer Lahai Roi, and it is between Kadesh and Bered. So what is the name for God? Obviously we know the Hebrew name we just read. But what is the name? How do we say it in English? The God who sees. In a real kind of basic terms, the God who sees. Now, that can be taken a few different ways. But in this case with Hagar, it was beautiful. She thought she was done. She'd been oppressed by a lady who was so harsh to her. She did what she had to do under the leadership or whatever of Abraham and Sarah. A lot of sin and compromise there. But she ran away and she thought her life was done. She thought she was going to die, her son was going to die. And then when God met her, he gave her a great promise. He actually didn't give her anything at that moment, did he? There wasn't great riches or a pot of gold. There wasn't into the rainbow or anything like that. He just spoke to her, obviously. But when God speaks, things happen and things change. I've had lunch with friends before that the friends would not know that I was really struggling with something on the inside. We'd go to have lunch, and we'd share a meal and spend an hour or so together. And then when I would leave, maybe the problem I had wasn't done away with, obviously, because they may have not known what I was struggling with on the inside. But I've had this happen so many times in my life when I'd leave the restaurant or wherever I was having lunch with them and get back in my truck. And my whole attitude, my whole perspective would be different. The situation wasn't fixed or changed, but as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another, literally their countenance changes. So if that happens between you and me as brothers and sisters, when we spend time with one another, encourage one another, and love one another, that, man, it can change our whole perspective. That's why we need church. We need the family. How much more when God meets you wherever you're at? See, that took it from the lesser to the greater. Man, I've had so many friends encourage me in ways that they didn't even know the impact it made on me. But how much more when God meets you right where you're at, when you're at your lowest? Nothing had changed physically in that moment in Genesis chapter 16. But now she named God. God, you're the God who sees. You saw me, a servant, a slave girl of no reputation, of no honor, of no respect, more or less. I'm a nothing. And you saw me? So how could you pray that back in your life? What would be some things you could say? She actually brought in the hurt and the harm back. You could take what you said back to the specific storyline right here, that God knew what had been wrong that had been done to her. And he saw that as well. He saw her, but he saw everything. And so he's going to watch over her. Man, what a beautiful promise. The God who sees. You can pray that one name of God for the rest of your life in 1,000 different ways. Just this one name. There's so many ways you can pray. God, thank you that you're the God who sees. You see my children who are not walking with you. And just as you were so gracious to me, thank you that you're gracious to them. Lord, you see the bank account. There's not enough, there's too much month at the end of the money, right? We've had those months before. Lord, you see. You're not blind to that. You haven't turned a blind eye or a deaf ear. You're the God who sees. You're the God who hears. You're the God who responds. See, when you think of the one sense of God who sees, then it makes you kind of jump into the next points of all the other senses from a human standpoint of what he does. He's not deaf to us. He hears us. He acts. He responds. That's good stuff.